The locket had not left her throat in 28 years. Dorothea Marlowe stood at the far end of the Ashvere drawing room, near the tall window that overlooked the kitchen garden, where she had stood at every gathering of consequence since she had first entered this house as a young woman of 24. She stood there because it was the appropriate place for a companion of long service to stand, near enough to be summoned and far enough to be overlooked. She had cultivated that distance with the same quiet deliberateness with which she tended the household accounts, corrected the linen inventory, and ensured that no visiting solicitor was ever left alone with the East Wing correspondence. Tonight, the room held 40 guests. The candlelight caught on the facets of Lady Westford's diamonds, on the crystal of every raised glass, on the embroidered silk of a dozen gowns that collectively represented more money than the household's annual accounts for the stables. Dorothea held nothing. Her gown was gray, her hair dressed plainly at her neck, her gloved hands folded at her waist as they always were. She had learned, years ago, that stillness was its own kind of invisibility. She had learned to use that lesson with the same unsentimental precision she brought to everything else. The Marlowe woman, she heard Lady Westford say to the woman beside her, the syllables carrying across the warm air with the easy contempt of someone who has never once needed to lower her voice. Still here, after all these years. One wonders what she knows that keeps her in his confidence. What she knew. Dorothea's right hand moved, the smallest motion to the place at her throat where the locket rested beneath her gown's high neckline. She felt its weight, the familiar press of silver against her sternum, the slight warmth the metal took from her skin across the decades. Then she was still again. Across the room, Edmund Pelham, Earl of Ashvere, was speaking with his land steward. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with dark hair now threaded through with gray at the temples and eyes of a particular shade of gray-green that she had watched for 28 years without ever permitting herself to call it anything but the Earl's coloring. He laughed at something the steward said, a brief, low sound that Dorothea heard from across the room the way one hears a clock one has lived beside for decades. She looked away. She had carried the secret for longer than some of the guests in this room had been alive. She had not yet decided what she would do when it came for her at last. If you have ever watched someone carry a thing so long that the weight of it has become indistinguishable from the shape of their spine, then you know something of how Dorothea Marlowe moved through the world. She had been 24 in the winter of 1797, a nursemaid of good education and reduced circumstances in the household of the previous Earl of Ashvere, the late Cornelius Pelham. She had come to the position through her father's connections, and she had performed it with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. She had liked old Lord Ashvere's wife, Lady Margaret, who was kind in a manner that cost her nothing and expected nothing in return, the rarest combination in Dorothea's experience of women in her situation. Lady Margaret had died in childbed in November of that year. The infant she delivered, a son, was the heir to the Ashvere earldom and everything attached to it, and he was alive, though barely. The physician said he would not survive the journey to London, where the old earl insisted the child be taken for the care of a better doctor. The physician said it plainly, with his hat in his hand and his face composed in the diplomatic neutrality of a man who has learned to deliver unwelcome truths to men with power and survive the delivery. The old earl overrode him, because the old earl was that particular kind of man who regarded his own wishes as a form of natural law. There was another child, not a week old, the son of a dairymaid on the Ashvere estate, whose father was the old earl himself, though no one named that fact aloud, and the people who knew it had developed the capacity of not knowing it in precisely the way that servants in such households must. The dairymaid had died of a fever 3 days after the birth, and the infant had been placed in Dorothea's care by a housekeeper who wished only to be free of the complication, and who had pressed the bundle into Dorothea's arms as though passing off a mending basket. The night before the journey to London, in the nursery at the top of the east wing, with the fire burning low and the legitimate heir struggling for each shallow breath beside the robust, sleeping son of the dairymaid, Dorothea had made a choice. She had made it slowly. She had sat with the weight of it for 4 hours in that firelit room, listening to one child breathe with effort and the other breathe with ease, and she had thought about what the morning would bring for both of them. The legitimate heir was dying. The journey would finish what the birth had begun. The other child, legitimate in every quality that mattered to God and to no one else, would be placed in service or worse, the inconvenient product of his father's carelessness disposed of, in the manner that such inconveniences were disposed of, without ceremony and without record. She had thought about Lady Margaret, who had been kind. She had thought about what the estate and the title would become in the hands of the old Earl's heir presumptive, a nephew in Bristol who gambled and who beat his horses, and who had, on his one visit to Ashvere Hall, dismissed the housekeeper for a perceived slight with a contemptuous flick of his hand that told Dorothea everything she needed to know about the manner of man he was. She had thought about the infant breathing easily in the cradle to her left, who had no name that anyone would say again once the housekeeper had disposed of her complication, who had been held once by his mother and would not be held by her again. She had put the question to herself plainly, in the manner she always tried to approach the things she found most difficult. What did God intend for both these children? The answer was not accessible to her. What did Lady Margaret intend, had she been alive to choose? That was more legible. The answer was in the texture of Lady Margaret's kindness, the way she had once sat beside the kitchen boy who burned his arm on the spit and held his unhurt hand without being asked and without any self-consciousness about the distance between his station and hers. She had looked at both infants for a long time. She had switched the names on the cradles. She had told the physician, who arrived at dawn, that the legitimate heir had died in the night, as was expected. She had watched him accept this without question, because a dying infant dying in the night was the expected narrative, and expected narratives require no examination and very little sorrow. He had written it in his ledger. He had written it in the manner of a man recording the resolution of an anticipated difficulty. She had wrapped the living infant in the dead infant's blanket and called him by the dead infant's name. Edmund. Edmund Cornelius Pelham. He had survived the journey. He had grown into a child, and then a young man of such evident quality that no one ever had thought to doubt him. He had inherited at 26, when the old Earl finally died of a surfeit of his own certainty, and he had managed the estate with a steadiness and fairness that Lady Margaret, had she lived, would have recognized as her own influence rendered forward through time by some quality she had passed into the air around her. He was the Earl of Ashvere in every way that mattered to every person who had ever depended on that title. The tenants said so. The servants said so. Fawsley, who was not a man given to declarations, said so with his eyes each time the accounts balanced. Dorothea had sought a position in his household the year he inherited. She had told herself it was because she needed the work, which was true. She had told herself this for 28 years, with the particular discipline of a woman who has learned to be honest about everything, except the one thing she cannot bear to examine directly. The letter she had received that morning before the evening's gathering was not from him. It was from a man named Reginald Hartmore, who styled himself the rightful heir presumptive to the Ashvere earldom by virtue of his connection to the late Cornelius Pelham's legitimate line, a claim so tenuous it had never been seriously advanced, and yet had never entirely dissolved either, the way certain legal shadows persist in the margins of estates, without ever quite touching the light at the center. The letter informed her that a solicitor's clerk had died in Bristol the previous month, and that among his papers had been found certain documents pertaining to the births in the Ashvere nursery in the winter of 1797. The letter informed her that Mr. Hartmore wished to meet with her at her earliest convenience. The letter did not threaten her outright. It did not need to. She had spent 28 years becoming fluent in the language of implication. She stood at the window and listened to Lady Westford's voice and the movement of conversation around her, and she made no plan at all. She thought only about the locket at her throat, and about the sound of Edmund's laugh carrying across a room she had stood in more evenings than she could count. If you have ever wondered what it costs a person of principle to hold a secret across the whole span of a life, you have perhaps assumed the cost is guilt. You are not entirely wrong. Guilt was present in the first years, a low, constant hum that accompanied everything she did in this house, every letter she wrote, every account she corrected, every morning she rose and knew what she was rising into. And it had not stayed simple. The truer cost, the one Dorothea paid each morning and each evening, was something quieter than guilt and more persistent. It was the knowledge that the thing she had done had been, at the moment of its doing, the most honest act of her life, and that she had spent every year since building a careful wall of silence around it. She had watched Edmund grow into the man the title had made him, or perhaps the man he would have become regardless, since she had never quite been able to separate what was his nature from what was his circumstance. She had watched him grieve his wife, who died of a fever 6 years into their marriage and left him with 2 daughters he raised with a seriousness that was also, unmistakably, tenderness. She had watched him navigate the estate's finances through the lean years after the wars, the tenant disputes, the flooding of the lower fields, and she had watched him do all of it with the quality she had first seen in him as an infant, drawing breath with effort in a cold nursery, persisting because something in him was constitutionally incapable of ceasing. She had watched him, and she had never once told him. There was an afternoon in the 3rd year of her service, a Thursday in October, when she had passed the open door of the morning room and seen him kneeling on the floor beside his younger daughter, who was then 4 years old, and had fallen and cut her hand on the edge of the grate. He had his back to the door. He was holding the child's small hand in both of his large ones, not yet having attended to the cut, simply holding, while the child pressed her forehead against his shoulder and breathed herself back to calm. He was speaking to her very quietly. Dorothea could not hear the words, only the quality of his voice, which was low and steady and entirely without any quality of impatience or performance. It was the voice of a man who believed that the child needed the steadiness more than she needed the attention to the wound, and who had the patience to provide it before he provided the other thing. Dorothea had walked past the door. She had thought about it later, in the way she thought about many things she could not name at the time of their occurrence, and she had understood that what she had seen was the quality she had placed on the cradle with his name, not manufactured, not the product of his circumstances, his own, particular, as individual as his gray-green eyes. She had chosen him in the dark, in a cold nursery, based on the quality of his breathing. And she had been right. She did not often permit herself to say that she had been right. She said it to herself on that Thursday in October, and then put it away with the other things she did not take out. She had told herself she protected him, that the truth, if known, would strip him of everything, and that the stripping would serve no one still living. that the man who would inherit in his place was Reginald Hartmore, who was now 40 years old and who had twice been censured by his creditors and once by a magistrate in a matter that no one in the county spoke of directly, but that everyone understood to reflect poorly on his character. All of this was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had not told him because she could not bear the moment in which he would look at her and understand what she had done, not the act itself, which she had made her peace with long ago, in the way one makes peace with an irreversible thing, by understanding it so thoroughly that argument becomes meaningless. The silence after. 28 years of proximity and confidence, and the particular intimacy of a woman who has managed a man's household since he was a young widower, who has known his daughters since they were small enough to fall asleep in the drawing-room chair, who has been the first person in this house to know of every difficulty and the last person to leave it unaddressed. All of it conducted over a void she had never once named aloud. The morning after the gathering, Hartmore arrived at Ashvere Hall without an appointment. Dorothea was in the library when she heard his name announced. She set down the household ledger she had been correcting, her pen very precisely in its rest, and listened to his footsteps on the marble floor of the entrance hall, followed by the measured tread of the butler conducting him to the morning room. She did not move for a long moment. She sat with her hands flat on the desk and breathed, which was what she did when she needed to know her own steadiness before she stepped into something she could not step back out of. Then she rose, smoothed her gray skirt, and went to find Edmund. He was in the study. He looked up when she entered with the particular quality of attention he had always given her, a kind of focused stillness. The pen set down before she had taken 2 steps into the room, his eyes moving to her face with a directness that still, after 28 years, registered in her chest as something she did not have a name for. She had noticed it for years. She had never permitted herself to call it what it was. "Hartmore is here," she said. Edmund's expression did not change. "I was not expecting him." "No," she said. "Nor was I." She watched something move behind his eyes. He had known of Hartmore's existence for years, the way one knows of a distant creditor, an abstraction at the edge of the estate's legal horizon who has occasionally sent letters that Fawsley managed without drama. He had never courted the acquaintance. Neither had she. "There are documents," she said. She heard her own voice, level and precise, the voice she had been cultivating for 28 years. "From a solicitor's clerk who died in Bristol, pertaining to the nursery of this house in the winter of 1797. Edmund was still. "I received a letter from Hartmore yesterday," she continued. "He wrote to me before he came to you. I believe he expected that to mean something, that I could be managed separately and quietly, that a woman in my position would know the practical value of accommodation." He looked at her with gray-green eyes that had always seen more than she gave them credit for. "Sit down," she said. It was what she said when the thing to be said required the room to be different from how it was. She had said it to him 3 times in 28 years. The morning his wife died, the morning his elder daughter's first suitor proved dishonest. And now, "I need to tell you something," she told him. She did not abbreviate it. She sat in the chair across from his desk and told him about Lady Margaret's kindness, about the dying infant and the robust one, about the 4 hours in the nursery, with the fire burning low. She told him about the physician who had not questioned the expected narrative, about the name written in the ledger, about the journey to London, and the months after in which she had watched and waited to see whether the choice she had made would hold. She told him about the solicitor's position she had sought in his household the year he inherited, and what she had told herself about that, and what she had not allowed herself to say. She told him about the locket at her throat, and she reached up and unclasped it and set it on the desk between them, its two small locks of hair sealed behind a circle of glass, one dark and one fair. She did not cry. She had considered, in some abstract and unexamined corner of herself, whether she might. But she did not. The thing she felt was closer to the sensation of setting down a burden of such long standing that the absence of it was indistinguishable for a moment from the absence of the self that had been carrying it. She sat very straight in her chair and watched his face. He looked at the locket for a long time. She could not read him. This was new. She had been reading his face across many rooms for 28 years, and she had always found something legible in it, some quality of response that her long familiarity could name. Now it was still in a way she had not seen before, the stillness of a man watching the ground rearrange itself beneath his feet. "The documents," he said at last. "What do they contain?" "I do not know precisely," she said. The clerk was present in some capacity at the births. A very young man then, I think. He suspected something, or noticed something, and wrote it down, and then lived with his uncertainty in the way people live with uncertainties they cannot resolve and do not wish to press. Now that he is dead, someone has found his uncertainty and is proposing to transform it into legal certainty. "Hartmore." "Yes." Edmund stood. He walked to the window, the study window that looked out over the east grounds where the lime trees were bare against a March sky, and he stood with his back to her for a long moment. She watched the set of his shoulders, the slight elevation of tension there that she had learned to read years ago, that told her he was thinking rather than feeling, which was the manner in which he approached every difficult thing before the feeling arrived at its own pace afterward. "You have lived in this house for 28 years, he said, his voice even. "Carrying this." "Yes," she said. "And you did not tell me." "No." He turned. She met his eyes. She had been meeting his eyes across the distance of appropriate rooms for a long time, across the formal geography of their stations and the furniture arranged between them, the silver at table and the correspondence at the desk. Not like this. Not with nothing between them. "Why?" he said. Not an accusation. A genuine question. The kind a man asks when he suspects the answer is more important than any other part of the story. She held his gaze and said the true thing, the one she had never once permitted herself to say aloud, because there was no longer any reason not to. "Because I could not bear for you to look at me the way you are looking at me now." He was quiet. "I knew," she continued, "that the day I told you would be the day I lost whatever place I had in this house, and in your regard. I was not prepared to lose it until I had no choice." "You have had no choice," he said, with something that was not quite irony and not quite sorrow. "For approximately 24 hours. "Yes," she said. "I know." He looked at her for a moment, steadily, as he always did, as if looking were a thing he did with the same deliberateness he brought to reading a document. "I am going to speak to Hartmore," he said. "I would like you to remain in this house until I have done so." She nodded. He took the locket from the desk. He held it for a moment in his palm, his thumb moving across the glass face in a way that was not quite deliberate and was perhaps the only unguarded gesture he permitted himself. Then he placed it back in front of her. "Put that on," he said. "It is yours." If you have ever witnessed the moment in which a person is told they need not cease to be themselves in order to be forgiven, you will know the quality of the silence that followed Edmund Pelham's exit from the study. It is not the silence of resolution. It is the silence of a held breath, of a world that has been told it must rearrange itself and has not yet had time to comply. Dorothea clasped the locket at her throat. She stood in the study alone for a while, then moved to the window and watched the east grounds, where the lime trees were bare and the morning was clear and nothing was happening yet. The meeting between Edmund and Hartmore lasted 40 minutes. Dorothea did not attend it. She tracked the sounds of the household with the attention she had given them for 28 years, identifying the second voice that arrived partway through as Mr. Fawsley's measured tenor. The estate solicitor, who must have been sent for before the morning was fully underway. She sat in the long gallery and waited, which was not a thing she did easily. She was standing before the portrait of the late Lady Margaret when it ended, looking at the painted face that had lived in this corridor longer than she had. Lady Margaret looked out of the canvas with that mild, specific kindness, a quality the painter had caught without perhaps understanding what he was catching. Dorothea had looked at that face many times. She looked at it now, and thought about what it meant to make a choice in a cold nursery on behalf of a woman who would never know it had been made. She heard footsteps, and then Edmund was in the gallery with her. And behind him, at a careful distance, Mr. Fawsley with his leather case. Edmund looked at the portrait for a moment, then at Dorothea. "Hartmore's documents," he said, "contain the clerk's journal from the winter of 1797. The clerk records that he overheard the physician tell the old earl that both infants had been healthy at birth, and then records, 2 days later, that the nursemaid reported one dead in the night. He notes a discrepancy, an uncertainty he could not verify and did not act upon, because a young clerk has no standing against an earl's household and no proof against an expected narrative." "The documents are genuine?" she asked. "Fawsley believes so." Edmund's voice remained level. "The clerk is dead, and the physician died in 1812. You are the only living witness to what occurred in that nursery." She understood the weight of that, all of its implications, and she stood with them without flinching. "Hartmore knows this," Edmund said. "He came here this morning to make it clear that he is in possession of those documents and that he has expectations regarding the disposition of the Ashvere estate. He was very polite about it." There was a quality in his voice that was not contempt, precisely, but sat in the same neighborhood. She waited. "I told him," Edmund said, "that any inquiry he wished to open was welcome to proceed." He paused. He did not expect that. "You cannot," she said. "Edmund. The title, the estate, your daughter's situations." "My daughters," he said, "are the daughters of the man who raised them. Whatever a court may determine about his birth, Fawsley has confirmed that the provisions made for them are not contingent on my legitimacy." He held her gaze steadily. "They are protected. I made sure of that years ago, when it seemed possible that my legitimacy might someday require examination." She could not account for that sentence immediately. He had known, or suspected, or prepared for the possibility. She filed this alongside everything else that needed examination, and said nothing. "There is a second matter," he said. He took a step toward her, one deliberate step that reduced the appropriate distance between them by precisely enough to change the quality of the air. "Fawsley will file the relevant papers. Whatever comes of Hartmore's inquiry will take time. Time has a way of absorbing these things differently than they are absorbed in morning rooms." He paused. "But that is not the second matter." She waited. "I have been thinking," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been thinking for some time and has now decided to speak the result, "about what you said." She did not ask which part. She knew which part. "You said you were not prepared to lose your place in this house, and in my regard, until you had no choice." "Yes," she said. "I find," he said, "that I object to the framing." She looked at him. "You have never been in danger of losing my regard," he said. "I am aware that you did not know this, because I have not said it. And I have not said it because I was attending, for many years, to what was appropriate between a man in my position and a woman in yours. I have been persuaded, until now, that what is appropriate and what is true were the same question." He stopped. "I find this morning that I am no longer persuaded of that." The long gallery was very quiet. Somewhere in the house she heard a door, the ordinary machinery of the household continuing its ordinary work. "Dorothea," he said, and the way he said it was different from the way he had said it in the study, which had already been different from the formal address of their long professional association. It was different in a way that she did not need to name. "I have known you for 28 years. I have had my household managed with a competence that I have never taken for granted, though I have not said so often enough. I have had your counsel on every matter of consequence during that time, solicited or otherwise, and I have found it invariably sound. I have watched you defend my daughter's interests with a ferocity that you would not have called ferocity, and that I have always recognized as exactly that." He looked at her. "I am not telling you that what you did in that nursery was without consequence. I am telling you that I understand it. That the woman I have watched for 28 years is not a woman who made a choice for the sake of concealment. She made it for the sake of a child who had no one else. She could not speak immediately. This was not because she lacked words. You do not yet know what the inquiry will produce," she said at last. "No," he agreed. "You may find, in 6 months' time, that your opinion of me has clarified." "I may," he said. "I find that I am not particularly worried about that." She wanted to say something cautionary. She wanted to say that she was 52 years old, and that she had spent 28 of those years in a position of dependency, and that she was not, at this stage of her life, inclined toward the kind of hope that required her to dismantle everything she had built around herself in hope's absence. She wanted to say all of this. She did not say any of it because she looked at him and understood. With the certainty of a woman who has spent 28 years learning to read a face. That he had already thought all of it himself and was asking her anyway. She reached up and touched the locket at her throat. "The dark lock," she said, "is from the infant who died. The legitimate heir by law, who died in the night before the journey, as I told the physician. I cut it because I could not leave him with nothing. No name anyone would say again? No stone anyone would tend?" She paused. "The fair lock is from you." He was very still. "I kept it," she said, "because I needed to remember what I had chosen. Not as proof of anything, as my own accounting." She looked at him directly. "I have given that account every morning for 28 years. I do not know how to stop." "Then do not stop," he said. "Give it to me instead, directly, every morning, for as many mornings as remain to both of us." He held her gaze with the same gray-green steadiness he had always offered her, across the length of rooms and across the length of years. "That is what I am asking." What followed was not immediate. These things do not resolve with the clean swiftness of a single conversation, and Dorothea was not a woman who permitted herself to be resolved quickly. There were several weeks in which she continued to manage the household accounts, and Edmund continued to conduct the business of the estate, and there was a letter from Hartmore's solicitor and Fawsley's response to it, and there was a morning when Edmund's elder daughter, who was 23 and perceptive beyond her years, looked between them at the breakfast table and said nothing, which was how Dorothea understood that she had seen everything and had decided the result was satisfactory. The inquiry Hartmore had filed moved as inquiries do, slowly and with the procedural gravity that the ecclesiastical courts brought to matters of legitimacy. The clerk's journal was examined. Fawsley prepared his counter-arguments with the calm thoroughness of a man who has long anticipated this particular line of approach. The clerk's uncertainty, in the end, was not sufficient on its own to establish the grounds for a formal hearing, and the court representative approached the only living witness. Dorothea gave her accounting in a room at the solicitor's offices in the village, with Edmund seated 3 chairs to her left. She gave it in the voice she had been cultivating for 28 years, level and specific, without ornament or self-exculpation. She said what she had done in the nursery on the night of the 23rd of November in the year 1797, and she said, why? And she answered every question with the same precise honesty she had brought to every household account and every letter she had ever written on behalf of the estate. She did not soften the chronology. She had spent 28 years performing that exercise internally, and she found she was no longer willing to do so. The court representative was a young man who had clearly not expected to interview a woman of 52 with gray hair and a composure that did not accommodate uncertainty. He made his notes and thanked her and left. Edmund walked beside her to the carriage. He handed her up, which he had never done before, with a formality that contained within it something unmistakably other than formality. She sat with her hands in her lap as the carriage moved through the village and out onto the road toward Ashvere, the bare hedgerows running level with the windows and the sky above them pale and cold. "You told them everything," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did not qualify the chronology or soften the moment of the choice." "No," she said. "I have spent 28 years performing that exercise internally. I found I was no longer interested in it." He was quiet for a time. Outside, the hedgerows gave way to the Ashvere Park wall, the gray stone running steady alongside the road. "I was married for 6 years," he said abruptly, in the tone of a man who has decided to say something and has chosen the moment without consulting the surrounding conversation. "I was very happy. Caroline was kind and sensible, and she laughed easily, which was a quality I valued more than I understood, until it was gone." He looked at the window. "When she died, I was 32 years old, and I had 2 daughters and a household, and an estate, and the particular conviction that I was equipped to manage all of it, and I was not equipped to manage any of it. And the only person in this house who knew that and did not say so was you." She looked at him. "You managed it for me," he said, in the manner of a person who understands that the useful thing is not to point out the gap, but to fill it. "I noticed. I have always noticed." He paused. "I have not always said so." "You have said so," she told him. "More often than you suppose." He turned to look at her. "Not as often as I should have." The carriage turned through the park gates. The house came into view at the end of the drive, its windows catching the thin March light. "Good," he said again, a different word the second time. The inquiry was closed 3 months later on the grounds of insufficient evidence. Hartmore removed himself to Bristol, where Fawsley had it on reasonable authority that his prospects were no better than they had ever been. The relevant correspondence was filed. The silence that followed was not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of resolution. And Dorothea, who had lived with the other kind for a long time, recognized the difference. It was a Tuesday in March when the decision arrived at Ashvere Hall. A cold, bright morning, the light coming in thin and clear across the breakfast-room floor, the garden outside showing the first gray-green suggestions of new growth near the house wall. Dorothea read the letter at the sideboard before anyone else had come down. She read it twice. She set it in its place and went to stand at the window. She heard Edmund on the stairs. She heard him pause in the doorway. "It is on the sideboard," she said, without turning. She heard the paper open. She heard the silence as he read. Then she heard him cross the room, and he came to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold morning air. They stood together for a moment without speaking, looking at the kitchen garden where the light fell soft on the bare beds. She felt him take her hand, not with ceremony, simply as a matter of course. The way one takes the hand of a person one has decided to stop standing apart from. The public occasion, when it came, was smaller than ceremony. It was a dinner, the kind the Earl held twice a year for the county families, 20 people at the long table in the dining room, with the candles lit against the April evening. Dorothea sat in her usual place at the foot of the table. Edmund sat at the head. Lady Westford was present, her diamonds in order, her attention moving across the table with the proprietary interest of a woman who understands that social arrangements are her primary intelligence source. It was Mr. Fawsley who offered the occasion, asking across the table when he might offer his congratulations on the resolution of the recent inquiry. Edmund set down his glass. "Mr. Fawsley," he said, with the level authority his voice always carried, "may offer his congratulations to Miss Marlowe, to whom the resolution is primarily owed." The table was quiet. 20 people with 20 forks suspended between plate and mouth. Miss Marlowe has managed the affairs of this household for 28 years, with a loyalty and an honesty that I have not always known how to name properly. He looked down the table at her, across the candlelight and the silverware, and the careful, watching faces of the county families arranged between them. "I am naming it now." She gave an accounting of events in this house that she could have withheld. That would have been easier, in every practical respect, to continue withholding. She told the truth, because she believed the truth was owed, regardless of what it cost her. He paused. A brief pause, exactly the length of a breath. She did not take what was mine. She gave it. The table remained quiet for a moment. Then Lady Westford, to her credit, set her glass down with a small, precise click, and the dinner resumed around it. Dorothea held Edmund's gaze across the length of the room. She felt the weight of 28 years settling differently than it had ever settled before. Not the weight of concealment, but something she had not previously known by name. The weight of being known and chosen anyway. She did not look away. The arrangement that followed was not announced with formal ceremony. It proceeded the way arrangements between people of long acquaintance tend to proceed, with a deliberateness that required no announcement, because it was already, by its nature, a conclusion that everyone in the household recognized without needing to be told. Edmund's elder daughter confirmed this understanding at breakfast one morning by beginning a sentence with, "When you are properly settled here," which she addressed to Dorothea with the tone of a woman managing a fait accompli. It was June before she moved her possessions from the companions' rooms off the gallery. She took the household accounts with her out of habit, and Edmund, finding her at the new desk in the sitting room, arranging them in their customary order, stood in the doorway for a moment, with an expression that was almost amusement and entirely fond. "You do not need to manage the accounts from here," he said. "I know," she said. "Then put them down." She put them down. He crossed the room and took her hands from the desk, and held them, both of them, in his. She was aware of the warmth of his hands, and of the afternoon light in the room, and of the quality of stillness that came over a person when she understood that she was, at last, in the right place. The locket was still at her throat. She did not think she would ever take it off entirely. It held a small accounting that she intended to carry for the rest of her life. Not as a burden, but as a record. 2 infants. 1 night. 1 choice made in a firelit room by a young woman of 24, who had believed, and still believed, that what she had chosen was the closest thing to right that the situation allowed. The kitchen garden was in full June green now. She could see it from the sitting room window, the beds thick and orderly, the stone wall warm in the afternoon light. She had watched that garden for 28 years from different windows. From the appropriate distance of a woman who tended what was not hers and stood always a little back from what she had, in truth, been tending all along. Edmund was beside her, and the afternoon held them in its quiet, and she was glad of it. She had spent a long time guarding the thing she loved most. She had not expected that the end of the guarding would feel like this, like standing in a well-lit room with her hands held and nothing hidden anywhere. She had not expected it. She was glad of it nonetheless. If you stayed with Dorothea until the end, leave a word below. Some stories ask only to be witnessed.